Which brings us to our speaker. He is an author, a journalist, and also the co-founder of Electronic Intifada. He has articles that have been published in The Guardian, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the New York Times, among many others. He is the author of One Country, a Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, and has also made a contribution to Midnight on the Mavi Marmara, both of which are available in the back there for purchase at tonight's event. His talk tonight is titled Boycott, a Nonviolent Technology for Peace and Justice. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ali Abunimah.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. I was told that I dressed appropriately for Olympia. I brought a crisp white button-down shirt that's in the car because I forgot to put it on. I was told that, oh, you really studied your outfit carefully for the evening. Well, it's very good to be back in Olympia. I was here in March, hosted by the Rachel Corrie Foundation. That was my first visit to speak in Olympia, and it meant a great deal to me then, and as it does now, always to be in Rachel's hometown and to see how Rachel lives through all of you and through the incredible work the Rachel Corrie Foundation is doing, that Olympia BDS is doing, and that so many people are doing. And, you know, of course, the Olympia co-op boycott was headline news in Israel. And so it's just one of the many ways that, Olympia keeps going back to Palestine and keeps the presence being felt there, and we'll say, you know, I will talk more about that. And I hope to talk for less than an hour, partly because I'm almost talked out, but really because I want to have as much time for us to have discussion, and I know that whatever I don't say, you're going to ask me about anyway. So, so it's a lot more fun if we're interacting with each other. As you, and I also want to thank, before I start, everyone who has made this event possible. I probably don't know everyone who's worked on it, so. I know that events like this always take a great deal of time and effort from people, and so thank you for that. And yesterday I was in Port Townsend, and it was where there is an effort to introduce a boycott in the co-op there, partly inspired, I think, by what you've done here, if I may be so bold as to say that. Daniel Bugel-Schunner, one of the initiators of the boycott effort in Port Townsend, is here and drove me here today, and has been a very gracious host as well. So in all these ways, you're impacting the global situation and making people talk about an issue that they don't want to talk about often. We were talking over dinner about how a lot of people, you know, want to talk about everything that's happening in the world, but become very uncomfortable when Palestine is mentioned. And so it's okay to make people uncomfortable when there's important things to talk about. If you're following the news, you'll know that the day after tomorrow, supposedly peace talks are starting again between the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel. And I don't think that there has ever been a production of the peace process theater. A few years ago, I wrote an article when they had a similar production at Annapolis in Maryland, when George Bush was president, and they had a big summit and a photo opportunity, and I said that the peace process is like one of these big Broadway shows that they keep reviving, and they just change the cast, and some of the cast members, original cast members, and then there's new cast members who come in. And it's always the same script. We're always told that there will be a Palestinian state within 2 years. A Palestinian state has been 2 years away for, I think, the last 15 or 20 years. A Palestinian state in 2 years. And so I always say that if only we had a time machine, we would be able to get to this Palestinian state. And so there is very little expectation of this so-called peace process. And if you've been following the news today, you may have heard that there was a shooting attack claimed by Hamas which killed 4 Israeli settlers near Hebron, 2 men and 2 women. It was reported that one of the women was pregnant. And although I always say, and I believe that Palestinians have a right to resist, I don't believe that resistance should include targeting non-combatants and civilians. Some people say, well, the settlers are not civilians because they're armed and they're part of the occupation, and they are part of the occupation. They're living on land that has been violently taken from its owners. Nevertheless, this is a case where clearly they were non-combatants, and we have to maintain that distinction if we're to maintain our own humanity, and also to build support for what we want, which is a future of justice and equality for everyone. And I think this renewed violence reminds us of a few things. One is that it struck me when, immediately the headlines announced this, that if only it were breaking news every time non-combatant or civilians in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq, where apparently we were told the war ended tonight, or Palestine. If it were breaking news every time civilians there were killed, then there would be no other news, really. There would be no time for Britney Spears and Levi Johnston and all that, because the screens would be filled with it. And it's also a reminder that the settlers and Israelis in general have gotten used to tremendous safety and security. It's actually extremely rare for Israeli settlers or Israelis in general to become victims of conflict-related violence. I believe that this is the first lethal attack claiming Israeli lives this year. There was an attack, a rocket fired from Gaza, which killed a migrant worker from Thailand a few months ago. But before that, there had been no Israelis killed in conflict-related violence. And the situation in 2009 and 2008 was very similar. The number of Israeli victims of conflict-related violence was extremely low. I wish I could say the same were true of Palestinians, but it isn't. 2009, in fact, was the year in which, since 1967, the smallest number of Israelis were killed in conflict-related violence and the largest number of Palestinians. The solution, of course, is not for more Israelis to die, but for fewer Palestinians to die, and in fact for nobody to die as a result of violence. That's what we want to get to. even one death is too many. And I think it's a reminder also that we have to hold ourselves and others to be very consistent about this, because all day on Twitter and I've been bombarded with requests that I condemn what happened today, and I made my views on it clear as I have here. But I've heard this from people who I never heard from on all the occasions when Palestinians have been killed, where the demands for condemnation and the loud chorus of condemnation comes out when Israelis are victims, but we don't necessarily hear it when Palestinians are. In fact, we hear the opposite. We hear rationalizations and justifications. The United States, the Obama administration, has been working hand in glove with Israel to bury the Goldstone report into the war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, and to make sure that there is no accountability and no justice for the victims in that attack. More than 1,400 people, almost 400 of them children, more than half of them civilians, and let alone the thousands of other Palestinians who have died just in recent years. So, if anything, the events of today underscore the importance of what you're doing here and the importance of providing alternatives to violence. Because what we hear often is that Palestinians Palestinians are used to hearing this lecture from people, they should be like Martin Luther King or like Gandhi. If only they would behave well, then they would get much further. Now this is refuted by anyone who knows the facts of the situation in Palestine, knows that non-violence has been the main characteristic of Palestinian resistance to decades of violent colonization, ethnic cleansing, and expropriation. Rachel Corrie was involved in non-violence when she was killed. When Rachel Corrie and others like her, many Palestinians, her Palestinian brothers and sisters engage in violence, the Israeli response is and has always been incredibly violent. And so it's not enough just to tell people, don't use violence. We actually have to do more than that. We have to provide them with an alternative. We have to step in solidarity and provide an alternative force. Because when there is no political process that offers people a path to redeem and reclaim their rights, as we've seen in so many places around the world, violence will fill the void. There is now a political void. The political theater of the peace process aside, there is a void. The Palestinians see no avenue through which they can reclaim their rights and live a dignified life. And I think that's what drives some to conclude that violence is the way. So it was to, in a sense, to break this dynamic and to provide an alternative path that Palestinians themselves launched the global BDS movement in 2005 with the July 9th, 2005 Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This came in the wake of the 2004 International Court of Justice ruling that the wall Israel is building in the West Bank, annexing additional large tracts of Palestinian land, is illegal, and that states around the world have a legal obligation under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The high contracting parties have a legal obligation to prevent this wall from being built, to ensure that it's dismantled. And the same with the settlements that were being built in the West Bank. And what we saw was complicity instead of action. We saw states doing nothing, and on the contrary, in many cases, colluding in various ways with Israel to entrench its occupation and to evade its obligations under international law. So, and this has been going on for decades, of course. We've never seen an example. You can find dozens of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions which declare that Israel's actions, its aggression, its occupation, its settlement construction is illegal and must stop. That the rights of refugees must be respected. That under international conventions, that Palestinians inside Israel have a right to live free from racial discrimination. All of that is on the books, but no action has ever been taken. So this is the rationale behind the Palestinian civil society campaign for BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. And it calls for international civil society to act where governments and international bodies have failed to do so. For us as citizens of the world, to take up that responsibility and to act. And what it calls for is instituting broad-based economic, cultural, academic boycotts on Israel until such time as Israel respects international law and the rights of the Palestinian people, and in particular the three sort of strands of this, or addressing what has been called the three-tiered system of Israeli apartheid. First of all, ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab land occupied in 1967. That's the West Bank, including Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Secondly, ending all forms of discrimination and guaranteeing the equality of Palestinian citizens of Israel, 1.5 million Palestinians who are inside the 1948 boundaries of Israel. And thirdly, respecting, promoting, and implementing the rights of Palestinian refugees, including the right to return home and compensation. And these are the three demands of the BDS movement. They do not impose a particular political statement. Some of you may know that I personally advocate and believe that a single state with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians is the right answer. That's the case I make in my book. And please don't make me carry any of them back to Chicago with me. But that's my view. But the demands of the BDS movement don't state that they must be fulfilled within one state or two states or 10 states. They could, in theory, be fulfilled within 2 states, but under conditions very different from those that are being discussed in the so-called peace talks. First of all, Israel itself could not be defined as it wants to as a Jewish state, which means in practice a state in which one group of people have special and better rights than others. It would be a state for the Jewish people who live in it, like the United States is a state for the Jewish people who live in it, for the Muslim people who live in it, for the atheist and Amish people who live in it, for whoever wants to live in it, a framework of law and equality that serves all its citizens. So that would be a quite fundamental transformation of Israel, that to become for the first time a democracy, which is not currently on anyone's agenda. So, but in theory, you could have it in 2 states, or 5, or 10, or what, or as the anarchists say, the no-state solution. But just to emphasize that point, the BDS call insists on the necessity of including the 3 basic irreducible rights that I've laid out for Palestinians under occupation, for those in Israel, and for the refugees in the diaspora. It presents a platform that not only unifies Palestinians everywhere in the face of the fragmentation that they face, but also appeals to international civil society by evoking exactly the same universal principles of freedom, justice, and equal rights that were upheld in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the civil rights movement in the United States, among many others. And it's a campaign that is initiated and led by Palestinians, so it takes its cue from those who are directly affected by this issue and who are taking the agency to determine how they want to conduct the struggle. It's also a campaign which I've said it's based on universal principles, but it's also open to everyone. It emphasizes that this is not a struggle between, heaven forbid, Arab and Jew, as it's sometimes very wrongly reduced to, and not even between Palestinians and Israelis. It is a struggle by those who are victimized by a system of oppression and apartheid against that system in order to free themselves from it. And it's a struggle that invites Israelis to join with them, Israelis who support those goals to join the BDS struggle, and some courageous Israelis have done so. There's a group called Boycott from Within, in which Israeli citizens have endorsed the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So when we act here and around the world, we support Palestinians, but we also support Israelis who are struggling against this unjust system. Now, so how does BDS work? What's the method by which it works? Well, you know, we don't call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions just to make ourselves feel good. We don't do it because just because we're angry at all the injustice, and we don't do it as an end in itself. The goal is not BDS boycotting Israel for its own sake. The goal is to bring justice and equality and universal human rights. And the beautiful thing about universal human rights is that they apply to everyone, not just to Palestinians. Palestinians may be the greatest beneficiaries because they're the ones whose rights are most violated, but Israelis will benefit from universal human rights. That's what makes them universal, and that's the beauty of it. Why can't negotiations in the current situation work? Why can't they work? Well, you know, people always say, well, it's very complicated. So I like to make things very simple, and I like to use a very TEE, my brilliant math teacher in high school, when we would get stuck on something, he'd say TEE, take an easy example. So I like to take an easy example. If you imagine that instead of negotiating over a country. We're negotiating over a pie or a pizza. And I see Steve there, so I'm going to pick on him. If Steve and I are negotiating over a pizza, and you know, it's going to get cold. Nobody likes cold pizza. So we have, you know, 10, 15 minutes to negotiate over how to slice the pizza, who's hungrier, who has more right to the pizza, who likes pineapple and who likes anchovies. I like both on my pizza. You know, I'm sorry for those who are fasting. This is a very bad joke. Those who have been fasting for a very long day. There's only 22 minutes left, so bear with me. While we're negotiating, I start eating the pizza as fast as I can. And Steve, you would imagine, would get very upset about this. And I would, with my mouth stuffed full of pizza, so what are you complaining about? We're negotiating. Now, of course, if he tries to reach his hand to rescue the pizza, I might strike him, especially if I'm much stronger than he is. What would his options be? I think everyone would think it would be pretty ludicrous for him to sit there talking as if nothing is going on. And if he has a family behind him who is relying on him because they're hungry, you know, it would be foolish for him to sit there and say to them, well, you know, I'll just keep talking while the pizza is disappearing. And you can see, you can follow the logic yourself. But the point is, if I'm much stronger than Steve and I can impose my will, his options are very limited. He could try to resort to violence to grab the pizza from me or to prevent me eating it. He could appeal to me, but if I'm strong and I don't care, then, you know, his appeals will go unheeded. He could appeal to the rest of you to come to his aid, and then you would have to decide what to do. You'd have to decide whether to stand by and watch and to wring your hands, or to tell him, well, Steve, just keep sitting there and talking and behave yourself, and maybe Ali will give you a slice of pizza. So it's very obvious that between people who are radically unequal, there can't be negotiations. There can't be negotiations. Are there any lawyers in the room? None, so I can butcher my legal example. Wow, I don't think I've ever been in a room of this many people without a single lawyer.
That's a good thing.
I guess. You know, even in law, a contract, an agreement isn't legally binding if one side has been coerced by another who has, you know, the strength to coerce them. So this is something that is very, very obvious to many of us. So a negotiation, a dialogue, an agreement has to be between people who come to the table as equals. And so you have to look at Israelis and Palestinians and say, well, can they negotiate? And under the current circumstances, what is the sort of balance between them? Well, on one side you have, you know, the Middle East's only nuclear-armed state with the most powerful weapons supplied by the United States, that has tremendous political, military, economic, and diplomatic resources, the full support, the unconditional, literally unconditional support of the world's only superpower. And on the other side, you have the Palestinians, who are a people who has been colonized, dispossessed, scattered, fragmented, and reduced to a situation where they are living in third world conditions amidst a, or under or beneath, or whatever the right analogy is, a first world settler colonial state. They don't have no resources, they have some. As we saw, they have some means to use violence. We saw that today, and we've seen that previously. They have moral claims and legal claims. They have tremendous legal documentation documenting their rights, but they don't have the resources or the strength to call for it to be implemented. There is no international bailiff you can go to enforce a court order. So what other resources do they have? So international solidarity is that resource that they're calling on. It's a tremendously powerful resource that levels the playing field somewhat. It creates a situation where Israel is no longer invulnerable, where there is a cost to the status quo, where it says to Israelis that if you want to go on living with a situation where 1.5 million people, for example, are imprisoned in Gaza in what is effectively, literally, the literal original meaning of the term, a concentration camp. A place where people are forcibly concentrated and gathered, usually people of a specific ethnic group. That's been the case historically. The British invented concentration camps during the Boer War when they concentrated Afrikaners in southern Africa. And they had an ugly history, an ugly career that has continued thenceforth. Gaza is, in effect, a concentration camp, a maximum security prison for 1.5 million people whose crime is one thing. Does anyone know what it is?
They voted for Hamas.
Well, the crime is that they are not Jews in the terms of the state of Israel. That's their crime, is that they fail to be Jews. Because all other things being equal, if they were Jews in the eyes of the state of Israel, they would not be behind watchtowers and fences and walls in Gaza. They would be invited to return to their lands, many of which are, most of which in fact are uninhabited now, and within a few miles of Gaza, they would be invited to return home. They would be given tremendous assistance by the state. They would be given jobs. They would be given all sorts of things. But because they're from the wrong ethno-national group, they don't benefit from any of that. Those who do, we see that Israel has organizations like Nefesh B'Nefesh, which operates in the United States and recruits Americans whom Israel would consider to be Jewish. It doesn't consider all Jews to be Jewish, but those whom it considers to be Jewish to come and emigrate and settle in Palestine. So we can see that it's a very clear ethno-racial distinction, and the BDS call wants to end that. So so what BDS says to Israelis is that if you want to continue with that situation, it can't be business as usual. You can't have massive violations of the human rights of millions of people, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank or Palestinian citizens of Israel or refugees in Lebanon or Norway or Australia or wherever they are, and have business as usual. There's going to be a price for that, and the price will escalate. But the good news is, if you respect the rights of Palestinians, all of this goes away. Now, this is very different from the Israeli version of boycott and sanctions that I want to just mention very briefly, because actually the most tight and harmful and damaging campaign of boycott and sanctions is not what That's someone who knows exactly what they want. The most damaging campaign of boycott and sanctions is not actually that of Palestinians and the solidarity movement against Israel, but of Israel against Palestinians. And this boycott and sanctions takes many, many forms. It takes the form of the denial of the right to education that millions of Palestinian young people have faced, that Palestinians who are as bright and smart and ambitious as young people anywhere in the world have had their life chances destroyed for decades because of occupation and apartheid that has systematically prevented them from their right to education, the right to housing, the right to medical treatment, the right to travel. So many Palestinian families are separated by the fact that they're stateless, or they're imprisoned in Gaza, or their Jerusalem ID cards have been revoked, or whatever other Byzantine administrative procedures have been used by Israel to remove them from the country or keep them out of the country. The silent war, biological, chemical and biological warfare that Israel is waging against people in Gaza. We published on the Electronic Intifada just a few weeks ago a report from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights that told me things that I had not known. I knew the water and sanitation situation in Gaza was disastrous, but something that really struck me was the level of toxicity in the groundwater in Gaza and the water supply because of the blockade, because of the siege on Gaza, which has prevented for years the importation of the equipment and construction supplies that are needed to rebuild the water treatment facilities that were deliberately destroyed by Israel, degraded, and then deliberately bombed by Israel in 2008, 2009. And one of the facts that really shocked me was the 90% of the water available in Gaza from its only source, the coastal aquifer, is undrinkable, and nitrate and chloride levels reach 6 and 7 times the international safety standards put forward by the World Health Organization. And what one of the international donors said about the water situation in Gaza: nitrate is a silent killer. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. But when consumed at levels even much lower than those present in Gaza, continued nitrate intake results in a reduced oxygen supply to vital tissues such as the brain. Nitrate intake is particularly dangerous for infants, for whom it can result in brain damage and possibly death. Information regarding the long-term consequences for the people of Gaza in this regard is still unknown. However, for as one donor has said, nowhere else in the world has such a large number of people been exposed to such high levels of nitrates for such a long period of time. There is no precedent and no studies to help us understand what happens to people over the course of years of nitrate poisoning. So what you have in effect is a giant human experiment going on in Gaza. And this is leaving aside all the other aspects of the siege that people are facing, the isolation, the trauma of the war, and the huge mental health crisis in Gaza. The fact that there has been no reconstruction. You may have heard after the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, which Israel attacked, killing 9 people on May 31st, there was a lot of talk about Israel easing the siege of Gaza. They allowed soda pop and potato chips in. But there has been no easing of the siege. The electricity in Gaza is still out for 8 to 10 hours a day. We also just published on the Electronic Intifada a few days ago, let's see if I can, a report by Rami al-Mihari, a correspondent in Gaza, where this is about families just moving in and taking over unfinished buildings and living basically in open structures because thousands of them are still displaced. There's been no reconstruction. We quoted the head of the here we go. The UN Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, who says, yes, they've increased the number of trucks coming into Gaza from about 70 to 200 a day. But the needs in terms of reconstruction for housing, schools, sanitation, and water, there's a need of, he says, tens and tens of thousands of truckloads that are not coming in. And to put that also in perspective, before Israel tightened its blockade of Gaza even further in 2007, there were 7,400 truckloads of construction supplies coming into Gaza every month. In the 1 year after Israel's attack on Gaza in the winter of 2008-2009, the total number of construction, of trucks of construction supplies coming in the entire 1 year after the attack was 40. This was according to the UN figures, 40 in a year, or 0.05% of what was needed. And this hasn't changed. It hasn't changed at all. And so, aside from that, we have to be very careful not to reduce the population of Gaza to a situation where we talk about it as just, animals in a cage, and, it's how much food you push into the trough through the bars of the gate. Not only are they being deprived of basic necessities, but they're being deprived of their very fundamental freedom of movement. The right to come and go, to leave. I mean, the first thing when you hear that so-and-so